Is this the art of the deal or the rhetoric of a war crime? 24 hours. That was the lifespan of the so-called historic peace brokered by the 47th President of the United States. We are witnessing a moment where the prestige of the American presidency hasn't just slipped. It has been traded for a handful of smoke and a pocketful of mirrors. Donald Trump, a man who built a brand on winning, is currently trapped in a strategic cul-de-sac of his own making. And the cost of entry was the moral standing of the Western world. Yesterday, the world recoiled as the President of the United States threatened to kill a whole civilization. Let those words sink in. This isn't the standard posturing of a hawkish administration. This is the language of the abyss. By invoking the total destruction of a thousands-year-old culture, Trump didn't just move the goalposts of diplomacy, he burned the stadium down. He crossed a dark linear Rubicon of international law, where the mere utterance of such a threat constitutes a violation of the Geneva Conventions and the U.S. military's own law of war. We are no longer talking about maximum pressure. We are talking about the normalization of genocidal intent as a negotiating tactic. But here is the bitter irony. For all that moral arson, what did it actually buy? A ceasefire that began to disintegrate before the ink was even dry. A triumph that Iranian officials are already describing not as a surrender, but as a list of American concessions. Trump launched Operation Epic Fury 6 weeks ago without a clear casus belli, and now he is frantically looking for an exit ramp. He needs the Strait of Hormuz open. He needs the oil flowing. He needs a mission-accomplished banner to hang over a Middle East that is more volatile now than when he started. This isn't strength. It's desperation masked by a megaphone. The White House today is painting a picture of a swift and successful military triumph, claiming the Iranian regime has caved to their knees. But look past the podium. Look at the shipping data. Look at the 800 tankers still sitting idle, waiting for a safety that does not exist. While the administration celebrates, the very mechanism of global energy trade remains choked. The strait was opened 6 weeks ago. It is closed today. That is the Trump math. Start a fire, fail to put it out, and then demand a parade for the smoke. We have entered a space beyond saneness. Throughout history, this is the hallmark of the megalomaniacal authoritarian, the belief that the threat of unbridled brutality can substitute for sophisticated statecraft. If January 6th was an attack on the internal architecture of American democracy, then the threat to liquidate a civilization is an attack on the very soul of the international order. There is no moral high ground left to claim when your opening bid is mass murder. The world is watching a rogue nation led by a man who views human life as a dispensable currency in a deal that he is already losing. To understand the collapse of this deal, we must look at what the White House calls Operation Epic Fury, a campaign launched not based on clear provocation, but on the desperate need for a glorious victory. Donald Trump didn't just want regime change. He wanted to alter geopolitical reality through sheer force of will. But reality is a harsh mistress. Over the last 6 weeks, the Strait of Hormuz, the jugular vein for 20% of global oil, has been transformed from a bustling trade route into a graveyard of economic hope. And remember this clearly. Before Trump started this war, the strait was open. Ships were moving. The current chaos is not a legacy inherited from a predecessor. It is a product manufactured entirely within the Oval Office. The current landscape is a calculated chaos that has spiraled out of control. As Trump retreated from his threat to destroy a whole civilization, he left a power vacuum that Iran is shrewdly filling. What the White House labels as Tehran's surrender is, in fact, a Persian game of Go. Iran agreed to a 2-week ceasefire, not because they were brought to their knees, but because they achieved exactly what they wanted: status recognition and a laundry list of concessions that the Trump administration is desperately trying to hide under a coat of victory paint. This is a classic script of power psychology. The strong man pretends to win to retreat, while the supposedly weak actor holds the strategic pieces on the ground. Why Pakistan? Why would a nation facing its own internal turmoil become the peace broker between Washington and Tehran? The answer lies in the shifting of subterranean power axes. Trump has discarded traditional European allies to seek support from partners who can help him molt out of a war with no exit. J.D. Vance's appearance in negotiations in Pakistan this weekend is not mere diplomacy. It is a blatant attempt to politicize foreign policy, turning an international crisis into a stage for the next phases of the MAGA movement. However, While politicians are busy staging frames for the evening news, the reality in Lebanon tells a vastly different story. This is Trump's strategic blind spot. The ceasefire, according to Iranian and Pakistani officials, includes Lebanon, where Israel has been bombing relentlessly. Yet Washington denies it. This inconsistency isn't just an administrative mix-up. It is a ticking time bomb. The White House poured gasoline on a raging fire by declaring that the peace deal does not extend to stopping Israeli airstrikes. The result? Only hours later, Iranian state media announced they had resumed the blockade of the Strait of Hormuz. We are witnessing the disintegration of a diplomatic model based on intimidation. Trump believed that by pushing verbal violence to the extreme, the level of genocide, he could force the opposition to accept any terms. But in geopolitics, an unenforceable and immoral threat becomes a shackle for the speaker. Trump is now trapped between a U.S. military bound by the laws of war and an adversary who understands that the American president is desperate for a solution to stabilize oil prices before the domestic economy bleeds out. Trump's radicalism has not brought peace. It has only brought a fragile pause, where with every passing second, America's stature is eroded by the very promises it cannot keep. To understand why a peace deal can evaporate in less than one rotation of the Earth, we must peel back the layers of the so-called art of the deal under Donald Trump. This isn't traditional diplomacy. It is an economic political model built on extreme risk speculation. In finance, they call it a pump and dump, inflating the value of a worthless asset only to sell it off before the crash. Here, that asset is the hope for global stability. The pattern we see here is a toxic feedback loop. Create an artificial crisis, push it to the brink of total destruction to paralyze the opponent's will, and then declare victory based on minimal concessions. But there is a fatal error in Trump's calculus this time. The Strait of Hormuz. This isn't a piece of Manhattan real estate you can threaten to demolish to squeeze a price. This is the aorta of the global economy. When Iran closes this strait, they aren't just blocking oil. They are holding a knife to the throat of the global financial system. Let's analyze the White House's concept-swapping technique. Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt stands at the podium orating about a historically swift military triumph. But look at the raw data behind the velvet curtain. Bloomberg reports that only 3 out of 800 waiting tankers are actually moving. That is a rate of 0.37%. In Trump's world, 0.37% is defined as a stunning success. This is the machinery of systemic deception, using powerful adjectives to drown out quantifiable failures. Why did Iran flip the script so fast? Because they realized Trump was playing a bluff with no cards in his hand. Threatening to wipe out a civilization is diplomatic suicide. It strips Iran of any room to compromise. In the psychology of power, when you corner an opponent with the threat of extinction, you don't make them afraid, you make them desperate. Iran knows that if they yield to a genocidal threat, they lose all legitimacy with their people and regional allies. Furthermore, look at the underlying economic drivers. Closing the Strait of Hormuz drives oil prices up, a situation that energy speculators close to power structures frequently exploit. There is a bizarre contradiction here. On one hand, Trump wants to open the strait to save face. On the other, the chaos serves the America First agenda of energy independence by strangling rivals dependent on Middle Eastern oil. But the real price isn't found in the cost per barrel. It lies in the collapse of the trust model. When the U.S. claims Lebanon isn't part of the deal while mediators say it is, Washington transforms itself into an unreliable partner. This is governance by chaos. Trump doesn't want a sustainable peace. He wants a sustainable headline. He needs chaos to maintain the persona of being the only one who can fix it. But as the fire spreads to Lebanon and Israel continues strikes with a silent green light from Washington, the permission structure for unbridled brutality has been officially set. We are seeing a president use the power of the world's most potent nation as a plaything in a cheap psychological war game. Trump thinks he is pulling the strings, but in reality, his impulsive actions are being exploited by Tehran and other rivals to expose the hollowness of the American empire under MAGA. When J.D. Vance boards that plane to Pakistan, he isn't going to negotiate peace. He is going to try and salvage a collapsing narrative, attempting to glue back the shards of a diplomatic model that was defective from the moment of its inception. To understand the peril of this moment, we must look through the fog of social media and tweets to see the ghosts of history rising. What Donald Trump is doing is not an innovation in diplomacy. It is a haunting repetition of autocratic leadership models the world thought it had left in the last century. When a U.S. president publicly threatens to destroy a civilization, he is no longer speaking the language of the founders like Jefferson or Lincoln. He is using the vocabulary of tyrants like Genghis Khan, or worse, the specters of the 1930s in Europe. In modern history, never has the leader of a nation calling itself the beacon of liberty used the prerogative of genocide as a bargaining chip. Even in the darkest days of the Cold War, when the world stood at the precipice of nuclear annihilation, leaders in Washington and Moscow maintained a baseline respect for the rules of existence. They understood there were red lines that, if crossed, would leave no world left to rule. Trump, conversely, erased that line in a single afternoon. Compare this to the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. John F. Kennedy faced an existential threat, but he chose the path of secret diplomacy, tactical restraint, and an honorable exit for his opponent to avoid global catastrophe. In contrast, Trump chooses to pour gasoline on the fire. He gives no exit. He demands public humiliation. And when that humiliation fails to yield results, he pivots to threatening the erasure of an entire people. This is not the strategy of a superpower. It is the psyche of a man backed into a corner while holding the nuclear trigger. The most terrifying comparison is with the very precedents Trump himself has set. If we thought January 6th was an attack on the foundations of American democracy, then the threat of civilizational genocide is an attack on the essence of humanity. It creates a permission structure for brutality worldwide. When the U.S. president says liquidating a nation is acceptable for a good deal, he grants a license to every other dictator on earth to do the same. This is the collapse of American exceptionalism in its most painful form. America is no longer exceptional for its kindness or democracy, but for its unbridled aggression. Looking at the current landscape, we see a contrast that is as ridiculous as it is tragic. While the White House tries to build an image of Trump as a new kind of peacemaker, one who can subdue enemies through sheer aura, the reality shows a king without a throne screaming at the tide. The collapse of the ceasefire in under 24 hours is the clearest proof that the world has stopped fearing empty threats. Nations like Iran and even mediators like Pakistan are learning to read Trump. They understand that behind the earth-shattering threats is a desperate craving for a media win to appease a domestic base. We live in an era where truth is distorted by the rhythm of primetime news. Trump has turned foreign policy into a reality TV show where episodes end in a dramatic cliffhanger, but offer no actual resolution. Comparisons to the past teach us this. Leaders who rule through fear and impulse usually end up causing disasters they themselves cannot control. Donald Trump isn't just gambling with the fate of the Middle East. He is gambling with the legacy of the United States and the very safety of the civilization he threatens to destroy. We stand here amidst the ashes of a peace deal that existed only as an illusion to ask ourselves a profound philosophical question. What is the price of a word? In Donald Trump's world, words are cheap, tools for shock, weapons for bullying. But when those words reach the threshold of genocide, they carry a weight that can collapse a world order built with blood and bone over nearly a century. The failure of this ceasefire is not just a technical diplomatic error, it is a clarion call regarding the disappearance of humanity from power politics. We are witnessing the birth of a post-ethical era in international relations, where core values are traded for short-term economic charts and sensational headlines. Trump tried to use brutality to force submission, but he forgot a historical truth. Real power does not lie in the capacity to destroy, but in the capacity to build and sustain trust. The warning here is stark. When the final line is crossed, when the threat to erase a civilization becomes part of the daily workflow in the Oval Office, we have opened a Pandora's box that no one can close. It creates a precedent where violence is no longer the last resort, but the first language. If the world accepts this as the way a superpower operates, then we are entering an age where darkness will have no borders. There is a terrifying silence radiating behind the White House's booming pronouncements. It is the silence of allies watching in horror at an America they no longer recognize. It is the silence of tankers sitting motionless in the Strait of Hormuz, waiting for a stability that never arrives. And it is the silence of history, preparing to record this chapter as one of the darkest moments for Western democracy. Donald Trump may believe he has secured a victory, or at least a pretext for retreat, but in reality, he has left a world more fractured, more dangerous, and more cynical. Peace cannot be built on the foundation of war crime threats. Prosperity cannot be maintained by choking one's own economic arteries. Ultimately, History will not remember the best deals Trump promised. It will remember the senseless brutality he was willing to unleash just to protect his ego. This is not just a diplomatic failure, it is a moral bankruptcy. And when a superpower goes morally bankrupt, geopolitical collapse is only a matter of time. Beware, for what is happening today is not the end, but only the beginning of a global crisis of faith that the United States may never recover from.